everybody. Welcome back to English 247. And this is for our class for Tuesday, the 26th. So last class, I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. So if you've got any questions about either one of those, please let me know. And I also had introductions. So in terms of my introducing myself, I was born and raised in New York City. I attended college at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, which has notorious winters. And when they had promoted themselves as a school where students could experience real winters, I had no idea what I was getting into. But nevertheless, I survived and I was majoring in English, minoring in psychology, absolutely certain I was going to go to law school afterwards. So you never know how your career goals might change because I took a Shakespeare class that changed everything. And I decided what I really wanted to do was to focus on literature. Instead of law school, I ended up attending graduate school in a warm climate, however, UCLA in Southern California. And no, they don't have winters. They have earthquakes and mudslides, but they don't have winters. And I specialized in Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Eventually finished up my degree and began teaching and realized that I was missing winter after all. So began applying to positions. A little school by the name of Greenfield Community College had a position open, so you know how this story ends. I applied, was asked out for an interview, and I remember us talking about what my transition might be like after I had lived so many years in Southern California. But I was assured that the winters here are not that bad. And I began in the 93-94 school year, which was a historic year because it was one of the worst winters on record. So I was completely unprepared. But nevertheless, I stayed and mostly teach English classes, but I also teach public speaking classes and I also teach media classes. So I teach a little bit of everything. And where we are is I wanted to finish up reviewing the syllabus and talk a little bit about some readings that I had optimistically scheduled for you to have done for today. But I'm well aware that this is the beginning of the semester and people are still getting books and they're adding and they're dropping and so forth and so on. So I view this as introduction before we begin our first major text. And in terms of our text, you can see that it's mostly novels. And ideally, you would read a novel in its entirety before we begin talking about it. So we're going to be talking about Frankenstein next class, and ideally you would have read it in its entirety, but I understand that you may not necessarily have had the opportunity to do so. We've got approximately a week for each of the major novels that we are going to be discussing over the course of the semester, and I've put them in chronological order. But for today, what I wanted to talk about was a little bit of background of what the 1800s was like for female. And also, I wanted to give us a short story that will begin our class from Kate Chopin, and we will also end our class with Kate Chopin. But if you'll remember, when I was reviewing the syllabus, I had skipped the plagiarism and artificial intelligence section. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. It used to be a fairly easy conversation to talk about plagiarism, that you're using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. And I would always give two stories to illustrate how it's best to avoid plagiarism. Both occurred pre-internet, and one actually occurred to me, and the other one did not occur to me, but both share some similarities. So the one that occurred to me early on in my teaching career, I'm reading a paper, again pre-internet, so I can't do any research myself to verify anything. But the paper sounded familiar, and I realized after a short time the reason why it sounded familiar. It was because it was from our college textbook that I had assigned for the class, with a few mechanical errors here and there. I'm not sure if the person was just a sloppy plagiarist, or perhaps they were hopeful that I wouldn't realize that they were plagiarizing if there were a few errors. The better story occurred around the same time to a middle aged professor. That part is important. And he's reading papers and he realizes that something sounds familiar. And after he mulls it over, he realizes the reason why it sounds familiar is not because he had read it someplace else, it's because he himself had written it. It was one of his old undergraduate papers from decades earlier that somehow, some way got into the hands of the student who submitted in this paper. It had something to do, I believe, with a fraternity that was recycling papers. And then it ended up all over the academic newspapers. There is such a thing as academic newspapers, because how unlikely can such a thing be that a student would hand in their own professor's work? As we all know, the game has changed with artificial intelligence, which is evolving as I speak. The artificial intelligence that will exist at the ending of the semester will be different than the artificial intelligence that exists right now. But I did want to draw your attention to the statement on our syllabus about artificial intelligence, that you should think of AI as a kind of professional tutor. Nothing more, nothing less. AI can either be used or abused, helpful or harmful, correct or incorrect, and or efficient or inefficient. For this class, which emphasizes thinking and learning, please use your natural intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. And there are a few reasons why I would prefer that, and I'm sure that you've probably heard about how artificial intelligence has a tendency to hallucinate, which means that it is not necessarily always giving accurate information. And I'm sure you've probably also heard some of the environmental issues surrounding the use of artificial intelligence and its incredible use of water and electricity. And I suppose if you are a doomsayer, you might think of science fiction films such as The Terminator, where ultimately machines become self aware and try to defeat humanity. But I suppose my biggest issue with artificial intelligence is the speed that this is a kind of industrial revolution, but in the past, this sort of change has happened over decades, not over days, which is where we are now, and I have some serious concerns about what that means economically, and what that is going to mean for our society as a whole. So, at least in terms of this particular course, I would encourage you not to use artificial intelligence. And you might have noticed that in the syllabus and other documents folder, I uploaded yet another document, and it's about our first paper. And I know it's quite early for us to be talking about papers because we haven't even read anything yet, but I thought you would be curious and certainly would want to know sooner rather than later. So I'm just going to review very briefly that document, which again is uploaded into our syllabus and other documents folder, that both of the papers we'll be doing. The first paper will be due approximately midway through the semester. The second paper will be due towards the ending of the semester. Are both critical papers. In other words, you should not be consulting any outside resources. So hopefully that will encourage you to engage in thinking and analysis, not necessarily relying on what other people or other computer programs have come up with. Paper length approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long as it needs to be for you to support your particular position. And I've given you a topic, but you can write on your own topic as long as you have that topic approved by me, and it is also addressing one of the texts that we are discussing this semester. In terms of documentation, because you will be quoting from the text themselves, not from outside resources, but from the texts themselves. You are using the MLA, or Modern Language Association system of documentation, and I will review that as we get a little bit closer to the due date, but I'm hopeful that this sounds familiar to you. And this system relies on parenthetical documentation. So basically, in parentheses after a quote, you indicate a page number, or if you are quoting from an online source, you indicate the author's last name. And usually it's followed with a works cited page that lists all of the sources that you've cited. But again, as I said, we will talk about this further as the semester progresses. So I'm thinking that the first paper would be devoted to one of the earlier texts of the semester, which begins with the story of an hour, but also includes Frankenstein and Persuasion, the two texts that are coming up. And that paper number 2 would address one of the later readings of the semester, which would include Jane Eyre, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or The Awakening. That's it. Dickinson's poetry, which sort of in the middle of the semester kind of straddles, is also an option. But talking about poems is a very different thing than talking about a novel or even a short story. So that's something to consider. And the quote I selected is from The Cult of True Womanhood, which was that opening reading that I had assigned to give us a sense of what the time period was like. One of my favorite quotes from the reading. Quote, "A girl could be ruined by a book which attacked or seemed to attack women's accepted place in society." And to discuss how that quote could be applicable to the text you've selected for your paper, remembering that you want to give textual evidence and details to support your arguments. And a good question to ask yourself, or when you are either reading or writing someone's paper or both, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? Pretty tall order. I had a very wise professor in college once say that a paper's never done, you just have to hand it in at some point. But obviously, the sooner you start writing, the more likely it is that your writing will be clear, concise, believable, and graceful. And you will see that at the ending of that particular quote, I have put parentheses with the author's last name, Biddle, and the page number, 9. And I closed my parentheses, and then I had my ending punctuation. Again, pretty standard for the MLA, but we'll talk a little bit more about documentation as the semester progresses. What I wanted to do was to talk about that essay, The Cult of True Womanhood, which is a fascinating piece in that we've got scholars looking at women's magazines of the time period from 1820 to 1860 to talk a little bit about the way that women were viewed during this time period. And the idea ultimately is that you can learn a lot from the media and the popular culture of the time. And I agree, because I teach a class in media and popular culture, and I even indicated, I believe last class, that I'm a horror fan aficionado, and I've even created a class in horror film, which goes to show that you can apply academic analytic skills to lots of different venues. But in this Cult of True Womanhood, it talks a little bit about the 4 major attributes that a woman should have. Piety, that a woman should be religious. Purity, that a woman should be a virgin. Domesticity, that a woman should be a homemaker. And then lastly, submissiveness, that a woman should be passive. Now, that's not to say that there weren't people who were questioning these 4 ideals. And that said, we will be reading texts from some of these women and see how they question these particular ideals. Piety, purity, submissiveness, domesticity. And the idea that a woman, in fact, one of her responsibilities was to be the pious one in the household, and just in case the husband strayed. And also the idea that a woman should be a homemaker, because ultimately it was her responsibility to create a home for her husband And the assumption was that women would marry and it would be a heterosexual marriage. And that is obviously something that wasn't necessarily the case with all women, but certainly it's what women's magazines were promoting during the time period. Purity. Now, I teach a Shakespeare class, and we talk a little bit about the idea, the importance of purity during the English Renaissance, Shakespeare's time, that a woman would be seen as damaged goods, in effect, if she wasn't pure. And in fact, the idea still existed in the 1800s that a woman was either a whore, a fallen woman, or a Madonna, this almost a spiritual being, and nothing in between. And women had no legal existence at the time period. They couldn't own property, they couldn't sue in court, they couldn't vote. They were very much under the thumb of the male authority figure during the time period, which usually started with the father and then was transferred over to the husband. And if a woman could do all of this, ironically, she could show a certain level of superiority and power over not just herself, but the household as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next class because I wanted to give you a sense of some of the ways that this would have been discussed in not just this time period, but in time periods that followed as well. And the idea that a woman would be completely submissive is something that we will see questioned starting with our very first short story, The Story of an Hour. In fact, perhaps it explains some of our main characters' responses and reactions when we think about these four virtues. And ultimately, I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read this article, to please read this article because it will give you a wonderful sense of how women were viewed at the time period, and that a woman served as not just comforter but also healer, as a kind of nurse. And that was another ironic way that a woman could show a certain level of power over the family. And keep all of these elements in mind as we begin to read these texts. And our first novel, Frankenstein, is going to be an odd text in the sense that, yes, it was written by a female author, but we will see that it is a very male-centric text. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why Mary Shelley, the author of that text, made those decisions, and ultimately how she might have questioned the cult of true womanhood um, based on her very subtle examination of society. By the time we get to the ending of the semester, we'll see that Kate Chopin is not subtle at all in the way that she questions these. And one of the quotes that I wanted to highlight was that women were viewed as being dangerously addicted to novels, and that women should avoid them since they interfered with serious piety. And think about how that would apply to the novels that we will be reading. Now, some of you have asked how to go about reading these novels. What I would do is just divide up the novels into sections and read a bit each day. More than a bit, obviously. This is a condensed class, so there isn't a whole lot of time. But many of you indicated that you're looking forward to the idea of devoting yourselves to reading, and reading does offer a certain level of escapism. So I hope that that's what you will find when you are reading these novels. I always think of these novels as a way to immerse myself in another culture. Um, and the idea of women questioning through literature is not the only way that women question their roles. There were also the blue stockings, the idea of women questioning through dress reform. And While the fashions were quite lovely during the time, they were also very restrictive and very uncomfortable. The corsets could actually be tight enough to break ribs. Shoes with heels are very difficult to walk in, and that basically slows down the ability for a female to be able to engage in physical activity. So, there are ways in which clothing can be used, much like literature can be used to help maintain the virtues of true womanhood during this time period. So, I gave you the story of an hour in part because it's a short story, so that'll give you a little bit of an idea of how to go about reading literature. And it was written in 1894 by Kate Chopin, and we will end the semester with Kate Chopin. And in this page and a half or so, we are given a life-changing hour. And some of the things to think about when you're reading, and I always recommend 3 readings. The first for plot, the second for analysis, and then the third to refresh your memory. Now, I understand in a condensed class like this one, that may not be possible, especially with novels. But do understand that the first reading is more about what is happening. Other readings after that are about why those things are happening, which is how you are going to think about writing papers. It's not just what's happening. In fact, that's the least interesting thing. But of course, if you don't know what's happening, you can't write about why those things are happening. And that's where we're headed in terms of writing a critical paper. All of these decisions are very deliberate by the author. And I've oftentimes argued that a short story may be more difficult to write than a novel because every single word has to have significance. If you're writing a novel, perhaps if your writing is a bit weak for a few pages, we can ignore that. But when you've got something that's about a page and a half long, everything counts. And what we're told in this hour is that Mrs. Mallard, already that's a wealth of information. We aren't given her first name. We're given her title, which is Mrs., which shows her marital status. Notice Mr. does not show marital status. And Mallard, and that's the husband's surname, which even to this day in relationship and marriage, usually the woman takes on the husband's surname. Mallard is a bird. Kate Chopin, a duck to be exact. Kate Chopin uses lots of bird imagery in her writing, as we will discuss when we get to The Awakening. And birds are oftentimes used as symbols for female. A bird can be entrapped in a cage, but also can be released to fly free. And what we find out is that Mrs. Mallard is told that her husband has died in a terrible accident. And it turns out that we're told that she has heart trouble, which is different than heart disease. Heart trouble would seem to suggest that this is more emotional rather than physical, as opposed to heart disease. And then when she goes off alone into her room, instead of grieving, she begins to experience an epiphany of the possibilities of freedom that will accompany being a widow. And oftentimes, this was the only way that a woman could achieve a certain level of independence in society. If she were a widow and there were no heirs, that meant that she would inherit the estate, which means that she would have financial stability. And she would also have social status, and that she wouldn't be looked down upon for being a spinster. In fact, society would oftentimes look upon her with pity. Or that said, maybe that could be one of the reasons why it was less likely for a woman to remarry after her spouse died than it was for a man to remarry after his spouse died during this time period. But nevertheless, Mrs. Mallard now becomes Louise, her first name. And notice the root of Louise, Louis, the idea of male surname. Again, the society that gives voice to male, not to female, that gives autonomy to male, not the female. And we learn about her sister Josephine, who's given a first name. perhaps because she's not in a marriage, and also the root of Josephine is Joseph, another male root, and I think that's all very deliberate to kind of reinforce this male dominated society. And then we get lots of images of freedom, and she's looking in front of an open window. A window oftentimes represents freedom and the outdoors, especially if it's an open window. She sees trees that were aquiver with new spring life. Spring is oftentimes seen as a time of renewal, rebirth, which is what's going to happen in Mrs. Mallard, who is now Louise. Renewal and rebirth. Delicious breath of rain. Rain can be seen as negative, but also positive. After all, rain gives life. Water gives life. It's something that Chopin likes to talk about is water imagery, which we will see in The Awakening, that it's very cleansing and rejuvenating. And the rain is finally moving along so that we've got blue skies coming. All of these are positive elements in terms of the transformation that Mrs. Mallard is going to be experiencing now that she's become a Louise. There's a peddler outside crying his wares, one of my favorite lines, because crying is usually represented as something that's negative, but here the idea of crying his wares, it's seen much more positive. The birds are singing songs, patches of blue sky. We're even given a direction west, and this is where the sun sets. Perhaps this is the ending of something for Mrs. Mallard. And when the sun sets, we assume it'll rise again. And that could also be important for Mrs. Mallard experiencing a new beginning. And the idea, too, of westward expansion, new horizons for our Mrs. Mallard, who's now Louise. And she was young, so one wouldn't expect that with heart trouble. But her eyes or lines of her face bespoke repression. And perhaps that's not too surprising after what we've talked about with the cult of true womanhood. And she doesn't necessarily want this. She knows there's something coming to her, and she's waiting for it fearfully. What is it? She's not quite sure. Her bosom is rising and falling tumultuously. It's almost sexual. And when we get to the awakening, we'll definitely talk about sexuality. And she's striving to beat this back with her will. Again, it's not necessarily something she wants, but then she abandons herself and says, free, 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 body and soul, free. And she didn't stop to ask if this was monstrous or it was inappropriate. It didn't matter. All that really mattered was the experience that she was having. And she did admit that she'd weep when she saw her husband's kind, tender hands folded in death. And he never looked with her save with love. So he always showed love to her. He was kind, he was tender, which goes to show that just because you're not in a bad relationship, that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't necessarily feel restricted, which is what is the situation with Louise. Because now there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She'd live for herself. And perhaps one of my favorite lines, there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And the reason why I like that line so much is because thus far we've been talking about what marriage means for a woman in this time period. But this line saying that men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature suggests that it's not just about gender, but it's about the institution of marriage and the institution of relationship where each partner tries to exert dominance, which really opens up the text to other analysis outside of gender. But it's pretty obvious that Kate Chopin, her focus is on gender. And Louise admits she loved him sometimes. So we see a certain level of complexity here. And if anybody has ever loved someone sometimes, then you can perhaps understand this. And what did it even matter? she thinks, as Josephine comes to tell her to go downstairs, and Louise is thinking about spring days and summer days, all of the positives that can be associated with the natural world. And she goes downstairs, and someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard. Notice he got his first name right from the beginning when we're told and the story that Brentley Mallard had been in an accident. And now at the end, again, we're told Brentley Mallard entered. And it was just a terrible mistake. And this story is short enough so that we can't speculate anything else but it being a terrible mistake. If Chopin wanted it to be something else, she would have given us some hints or clues for us to try to determine that it was something else. And it turns out, of course, that Mrs. Mallard, because she has heart trouble, now references heart disease, is so overcome by what she sees is that she dies of a heart attack or of joy that kills. And of course, she dies of heart disease, not heart trouble, or at least that's the way the doctors and those around her view the situation. And they think that she dies of just the joy that her husband's not dead. And while there is a possibility of that, after all, she had loved him, and after all, he was kind, we know what the other characters don't. That she also is overcome by not just shock, but grief. And the fact that her husband is still alive. And that means that the opportunity for her to have this new life of freedom has been snatched away from her. So this short story ends with irony, as short stories oftentimes do. And I teach this short story in my introduction to literature class. And in our textbook, it asks, I think, some really interesting questions. That is it possible to find Mrs. Mallard sympathetic because some think she's callous, selfish, and unnatural, even monstrous? But then others see her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male dominated society. And perhaps both are possible. And are your views in any way influenced by your gender? Or perhaps your age, or your social and economic background, or your nationality, race, or religion? Or do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessments? And I love those questions because it shows how fluid analysis is that, yes, we have the text itself, but ultimately we bring our own perspectives and our own biases. Our job is to basically find evidence from the text to support a position so that our position can be possible. It doesn't even have to be probable, just possible. So as I shared with you, at the beginning of this video, I had intended to go to law school. And English majors oftentimes go to law school because it teaches many of the skills that you need as a good attorney, which is putting together pieces of evidence to convince someone of a particular argument. And that's basically what we will be doing with the pieces of literature that we're reading. And this is basically what we're going to be doing when we are writing essays about this. We're taking a position that reasonable people could disagree with, and we are picking the pieces of evidence that will support our position so that it's possible, not necessarily probable or correct, just possible. So next class, I'll talk a little bit more about the role of women during the 1800s and also the 1900s. And we will also talk a little bit about Frankenstein. And I've already given you a little bit of a sense that there's a very male-dominated text, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But what's left is our attendance question. You'll see that I've responded to all of your introductory responses for your last discussion forum. So now you have a new question to respond to, and it's about the ending of Kate Chopin's piece. Did you like or dislike Chopin's ending, joy that kills, and why? And obviously, there's no right or wrong answer to this. I like to ask those kinds of questions that don't have right or wrong answers, where it's more about your reasoning and your debate. You're not required to respond to your peers, but you are encouraged to. You are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. And if you will see in the notes below, all of these pieces are covered that I've talked about, as well as how I have retired last week's class into the folder about past class sessions. So now what you have visible on our Moodle page is this upcoming week. So I will leave you to answer the attendance question. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, and we will talk about Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.